Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. As I said in my introductory video, and as you probably heard me repeat in our initial Zoom meeting, there are a number of topics that I like to explore every year in class before we begin our work in the Cambridge Latin course. And the first of these involves the question why there are so many Latin words in English and why we use these words the way we do. Now, one of the main reasons we study Latin at the high school level is that it helps build academic vocabulary in English. Words of Latin origin are extremely prominent in the sciences, in medicine, in government and politics, in the legal system, in theology, philosophy, you name it. There's a reason for this, and it has very little to do with the intrinsic nature of the Latin language. It's not like Latin is uniquely well suited to serve as the vehicle for abstract ideas and deep thoughts, but that's exactly what it has done in English since the very beginning. To understand why, I want you to think for a minute about the position of English itself in the modern world. English started out on just one part of this tiny island, England, but today it's spoken by hundreds of millions of people all over the world. I'm speaking it now, and you can understand me because it's spoken in the United States and Canada. It's spoken in Australia and in New Zealand. It's spoken across the Indian subcontinent and in a whole lot of countries all over sub-Saharan Africa. The reason for this has nothing to do with the intrinsic nature of the English language. It's not like English is particularly easy to understand or to learn. Just ask anyone who's ever had to learn English as an adult and they'll tell you English is actually really hard. There's all these words that aren't spelled the way they sound. There's all these homophones, too many twos. So no, English was not adopted around the world because it was easy. Rather, it was spread by British colonialism and imposed on people by the British Empire. But when the empire ceased to exist and these countries gained their independence from Britain, English continued to be spoken by many people because it provided a convenient means of communication between groups that did not share a common language. There are dozens of languages spoken in India, right? Hindi and Urdu are the biggest, but there's Telugu and there's Tamil and there's Bengali and many other languages. But because of the legacy of British colonialism, these people are able to communicate with each other in government, in education, even in entertainment, through the medium of English. There are three major ethnic groups in Nigeria, each with its own language: Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo. But English continues to serve as the language of the federal government and of higher education. People may not speak it at home, but they learn it in school, and the more schooling they get, the better their English tends to be. So even though the British Empire no longer exists, English continues to be an important and useful language spoken in the countries that once belonged to it. Now, the exact same thing could be said about the continued use of the Latin language in the countries that used to belong to the Roman Empire. I draw this map on one of the whiteboards in K-112 at the beginning of every school year. At the end of the year, I have to erase it, but I don't mind because it's relaxing to draw. It's a map of the Roman world, what they would refer to as the orbis terrarum, the circle of the lands. Now, you see the word orbis and you think orbit, and you're thinking about planets. Terrarum, you may think of terrain or terrestrial, and these are derivatives of these Latin words. But when the Romans talked about a circle of lands, they weren't thinking outer space. Now, I should preface this by saying that the Romans understood that the entire world was round and revolved around the sun. They had learned this from Greek astronomers and didn't need to wait for a Christopher Columbus to teach it to them. But when they used the phrase orbis terrarum, they were thinking about the way that the provinces that they governed encircled a central sea, which they referred to as the mare Mediterraneum. Medius means middle, terra again means land, so it's the sea that's in the middle of the lands, which we still know as the Mediterranean. Now, the other words that you see all over this map are the Roman names for various provinces in their empire. The people who lived in these places wouldn't necessarily have used these names or even understood Latin before the Romans reached them because, like English, Latin started out as the language of a relatively small group of people here in central Italy, right? Rome was founded in 753 BC, and before that time, Latin was just one of many languages spoken in this area of central Italy. But as Rome's influence grew over the Italian peninsula and eventually over the entire Mediterranean, they brought the language with them. It spread with their colonists, it spread with their legionaries, and became a language that many people would have spoken alongside of their native regional languages. Now, to understand what all this has to do with the number of Latin words that there are in English, which is the reason we're having this conversation, I want you to look at the top left-hand corner of the whiteboard where you see the word Britannia. Now, Britannia is the Latin name for a province the Romans ruled for almost 400 years. It's so far north that it doesn't fit on my map, but it's obviously the island we know today as Britain, or more commonly as England. Now, the original inhabitants of this island did not refer to it by either one of these names. Right? They didn't consider themselves British, couldn't consider themselves English, because the idea of England didn't even exist until long after the Romans left. Rather, the people on the island knew themselves collectively as Celts. They had lots of local names for local groups, local chieftains, but they called themselves the Celts collectively, and they were closely related to the inhabitants of what we today know as France, what the Romans referred to as Gallia. Now, these Celts didn't have a centralized form of government like the Romans did. So when they came to be ruled by the Roman Empire, they learned the Latin terminology that was associated with this new form of government. They didn't live in cities. They lived in hilltop fortresses. So when the Romans came and built cities and roads to connect them and aqueducts to supply them with water, the Celts learned the terminology that was associated with these institutions and these conveniences in Latin. The Roman system of education was all in Latin. And when the empire converted to a new religion, Christianity, this too was introduced to the Celts in Latin. They learned the liturgy of the church and all the terminology of the church's, hierarchy in Latin. Anyway, after about 400 years of this, you can imagine that even when the Celts are speaking their own language, there's whole areas of their lives that they can only describe using Latin words, Latin concepts. So when the Romans finally leave the island, they don't just leave behind a lot of crumbling infrastructure, they leave a big chunk of their language among the Celts. To complete the transformation of this language into what we'll call English, we just have to watch the process repeat itself. Because no sooner do the Romans leave the island than groups of German tribesmen, known as Angles and Saxons, start coming across from the mainland. They kind of push the Celts into the furthest corners of the British Isles, places like Wales, like Scotland, like parts of Ireland, where their languages are still spoken to this day. These Germans are just like the Celts used to be. They're unfamiliar with all this Roman civilization. And so once they get beyond the sort of murder and mayhem phase of the invasion, they start asking questions. What's that? It's an aqueduct. What does it do? Brings clean water from a distant source. Nice. I don't have a word for that. I'm going to call it an aqueduct. Eventually, the language of these Angles and Saxons will develop different registers, with German words used to describe everyday objects and activities, and Latin-derived vocabulary applied to institutions and ideas associated with the Romanized culture they encountered in Britannia. We still see this all the time in English. Here's a simple example of what I mean. The word hand is Germanic in origin. It's a noun, it's a verb, hand it over, handle with care. The Latin word for hand is manus, like the Spanish word la mano. We don't actually use this word in English, but we use a lot of words that are derived from it, all of which have a kind of specialized or technical sense. Manual, manufacture, manipulate, manicure, manumission. Now, these aren't exactly everyday words, and I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't know what the word manumission actually means. The point is, we use simple Latin words to produce all kinds of technical shades of meaning in English that would be difficult to achieve if all we had was the Germanic word hand, right? So, I mean, you can kind of go down the list. You can say a manual is a handbook. Or if you say it's something that you have to do manually, you have to do it handily. It's hard to do that. You could say that manufacture is handicrafts, that manipulation is, see, there's a shade of meaning I can't really achieve. Manicure, that's just a thing. I can't come up with a hand care, but I mean, it doesn't really mean the same thing. And I'll leave manumission aside, the legal act of freeing a slave. I don't know how you say that in German. I bet you they just use some kind of a Latin derivative there as well. This is a subject that we will return to many times during this class. Today's goal has simply been to give you a little bit of historical context for how these layers of language developed in English and why English is such a massive language in terms of its vocabulary. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because I'm at 11 minutes, which is about a minute longer than I like to go on any of these introductory topics. You're not responsible for any of the information that I've attempted to convey in this video. There is a discussion question I would like you to respond to, which simply involves modern names for the countries that you see here on my hand-drawn whiteboard. So I want you to identify the names, the modern names of 3 of the Roman provinces that you see here. Beware, 2 of the province names are now the names of entire continents, and we'll talk about that at another time. Until then, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time.